Here's a quick overview of the topics we're going to cover in this week's lecture: why corporate social responsibility, types of corporate social responsibility, the quadruple bottom line, is socially responsible business good business, and the Merck case. So let's start by defining what corporate social responsibility is. It can be defined as responsibility beyond economic and legal obligations to act ethically and to contribute in a positive way to society. And so we know that corporations have a certain financial and ethical responsibility, but CSR, I'm going to start calling it CSR from this point, really is sort of that next step, sort of going above and beyond the simple economics, but to have a positive impact on society, even beyond the wonderful products that it makes and the fact that it employs people and that it contributes to the larger economic world. But it really it views itself as a positive actor in society, making a positive contribution. Now, some of the questions are why corporate social responsibility? And the book outlines three here. The first is what's called the pragmatic, to maintain legitimacy, protect reputation, and viability. And we must use power, responsibility, or risk losing it. So this really is the idea that says if we're not socially responsible, then society and some of the stakeholders, which we'll talk about in a bit here, can look down upon us, and it might even be to the point where they no longer value us as a business, where they no longer see us as responsible, and therefore we lose our business. So the pragmatic sense says, yes, if we're not responsible, then we could actually go out of business because people will no longer value us. Then there's the ethical reason. As a part of society, we have the responsibility to behave ethically and to contribute to the greater good. Now, we believe that as individuals, we have a moral responsibility to be ethical. And I suppose this approach would say that corporations, in a sense, have a moral responsibility to behave ethically and provide and to act in socially responsible ways. Now, the book was a little bit squishy on this point, in my opinion. They said because it's the right thing to do. Now, I would agree with that. It is the right thing to do, but there's lots of things that we could say, well, it's the right thing to do, and different people could argue over that. But I suppose, going back to our ethics theory, this would be sort of the deontological perspective that says, yes, it's a good thing, it's inherently good, and it does not need any description or validation to say that organizations should be socially responsible. And then, of course, there's the strategic perspective, and this is the idea that Michael Porter and others have put forward, is that being socially responsible creates shared value and can differentiate one from its competitors. And when society prospers, business prospers, they are partners. So this is the idea that says you can actually do something that is responsible and it benefits your organization as well. And there are some good examples in the book of this. And in some ways, this is what sets companies apart, and your shareholders, your stakeholders rather, might actually like that sort of thing. So for example, if you're an organization like, say, REI, and you're big on providing, sportswear and camping stuff, and, for people that like to spend time outdoors. Well, guess what? You're probably going to invest in the types of CSR things that are geared towards the environment and those sorts of things. So if you're an environmentalist and you like the outdoors, that's the kind of connection you're going to make with an organization, right? So you might. So if you are a company like REI and that's your mission to help people enjoy the great outdoors, then it makes a lot of sense. It's kind of a strategic way that you can really connect with and ensure shareholder value. And then, from a larger perspective, and I think this was Porter's argument, is that when society prospers, business prospers, they are partners. Now, this, of course, takes kind of a big picture thinking, right? Because most people think, well, I don't really care what's going on in the larger society. I just need to, ensure my bottom line and my numbers are met. So you really sort of have to take a bigger view. It is kind of a philosophical argument when you think about it, but really it is true that when society prospers, that business prospers, right? So when people do good in society, so let's just kind of take an extreme example. From environmentalism, say if you're a company and you're polluting the environment and people are getting sick, right, and people are moving away, well, they're not going to be able to buy your goods and services anymore. So it's incumbent upon you to be a contributor to the overall well-being of society, so that people can enjoy your products and can buy your products. All right. So those are the three levels. Some of the three reasons why you should engage in corporate social responsibility. Now, earlier on in the class, we've talked about stakeholders a couple different ways. We've talked about it sort of a micro level, so who are the stakeholders in a particular ethical incident, right? Well, this is kind of a bigger picture. It's looking at stakeholders from an overall society perspective. So you have in the middle there, you have the organization, the owners, that might be the stakeholders proper, or the shareholders rather, and then the employees. But then you have all of these people out in the environment, right? So people like your customers, your competitors, community and interest groups in the media. And this is a big one, right? Because we know, one of the reasons that we mentioned before, the pragmatic reason why you would engage in CSR is because if you're irresponsible sort of organization, with today's ubiquitous media, social media, cell phone videos going viral overnight, all of a sudden, then you can be seen by the community through social media as a bad actor, so to speak, right? And that will almost immediately impact your bottom line. And so some of these organizations that have suffered some of these viral videos and whatnot, abuse of animals and slinging chickens around and stuff like that, they all of a sudden, they're in a world of hurt because of the media. So that's an example of a stakeholder. And then of course there's the government, who oftentimes insists on certain responsible actions, suppliers, and financial institutes and analysis. And suppliers is kind of interesting, and it really raises the question, to what degree is an organization responsible down the supply chain, right? Ethics across the supply chain. Are you responsible for how your products are sourced? And I think a great example here was Apple and their use of Foxconn in China. And there was some stuff that came out, some negative press that came out and some things that happened to some employees there, right? And so all of a sudden Apple's taking the heat. Well, there weren't Apple's employees, right? That's true. But, if you believe in ethics across the supply chain, you have to understand that your suppliers are an important part, they're an important stakeholder that impinges upon your reputation as being a socially responsible organization. All right, enough said about that. This is a nice little chart here that sort of shows the level of responsibility in which organizations are responsible for. So the bottom shows the basic economic responsibilities, right? So this is kind of the Tom or Milton Friedman idea that if there's no profit, there's no organization, and that the basic responsibility of any organization or corporation, in this case, is to make money. And if they don't make money, then they can't really stay in business very long. So that's sort of the basic economic responsibility. And this is true, of course, right? If you don't make a profit, you can't pay your employees, right? You can't invest in R&D, and you can't grow, and those sorts of things. And then, of course, there's legal responsibilities, right? Because there's lots of governmental regulations. This is a basic responsibility. And then there's ethical responsibilities, and we'll talk more about kind of larger organizational ethical responsibilities, but this is sort of, what's the right thing to do as an organization. And then you kind of move on to sort of what we're talking about this week, was sort of those philanthropic responsibilities. And this is sort of the above and beyond, doing things because they're good things to do. All right, so this is a good conceptual model here of the levels of responsibility. So I guess you could argue really that the bottom three really aren't CSR proper. I would say that the philanthropic responsibilities really is the only one that's considered CSR. The others are definitely responsibilities, but when I think of corporate social responsibility, I think of that kind of above and beyond kind of idea. Now, an idea which has gained a lot of traction in the last few years is something called the triple bottom line. And let's talk about that. And then I'm going to add something which has been called the quadruple bottom line. First of all, this is similar to the other model, right? That there's the economic responsibility that any organization has, right? To produce a reasonable return, rate of return for their shareholders and other stakeholders. And then there's the social responsibility. And this is the idea that that organizations, corporations have a responsibility to do good by their people, by their employees, by people in the immediate community. And then there's the environmental, right? And this is the idea that that corporations shouldn't be abusive of the environment. So they shouldn't have a footprint, environmental footprint that's any larger than it needs to be. They shouldn't consume more energy than they need to. They should be responsible in terms of pollution and those sorts of things. So most of you know this is a pretty big deal these days. So this is what's called the triple bottom line. Now, let me add another bottom line here, in addition to economics, social, environmental. As Christians, we would also believe that there's a certain spiritual responsibility that corporations have. And this idea that God has given us the responsibility, that He's given us the wherewithal to start organizations, and that He wants to use our organizations, our corporation, as a blessing to society, right? So we're not just here just to take and to make a profit, but in what way can you as a company be a blessing, be an instrument of God's blessing to the society? And so there's a lot of people that take this idea of what's known business as mission. You know, how can us, those who are Christians, engage in business, not just from a profit perspective, but to see the business as a means by which God can bless other people, right? So we can hire people, we can treat people with respect and dignity. We can be concerned about the spiritual well-being of our employees, right? So this kind of goes beyond the other three, and it kind of leads to this question, and again, this is for Christians who want to engage in a full model of who see themselves as responsible of being God's agents in society, not just to make a profit, but to bless others through our business. Do businesses have a responsibility for the spiritual well-being of its stakeholders? And if we were in a class, we could have a conversation about this. Maybe we could have a discussion thread about it. But I believe it's a very important and interesting question for us to ask, those of us who see ourselves as God's agents, of God's ambassadors in this world. How is that going to manifest itself through our businesses? Now, one of the cases that the book covered, and this is kind of a classic here, is the Merck case. And hopefully you read this case study. I believe it was towards the end of the chapters. It's kind of a big one, but this is a classic, really, of economic responsibility. Well, actually, it has a lot of angles to it. And if you haven't read that, I want you to pause now and go back and read that, because the rest of this isn't going to make any sense until you really understand that case. All right, so hit pause now and go on and listen to it, or read it rather. Now, let's recap the case here. Essentially, there is a company called Merck, and they were a pharmaceutical company. And they developed a drug that would cure a disease, a horrible disease called river blindness. And this river blindness affected thousands and thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, primarily in Africa, some in South America, if I recall. And they were able, sort of a fluke, actually, they weren't really looking to cure this disease, but through R&D, they came up with a drug that had the properties to cure that disease. And it was a wonderful thing, right? But here's the thing. The drug, they could not pay for the drug, right? And it cost, I believe, billions of dollars to bring this drug to market. So that's really the challenge as a pharmaceutical company, and why drugs are so expensive is because it takes billions and billions of dollars. And sometimes they develop drugs that really there's not a market for it in the traditional sense. In other words, there's not enough people to pay for it to make all of that investment in R&D worthwhile. And so that was the case here with the drug that was going to cure river blindness. And what these are called are orphan drugs. They have very little market. So the question here really is, what kind of a responsibility does Merck have? Because they have the drug, and the drug has the potential to help thousands and thousands of people. So let's take a look at this case here in terms of these several layers of corporate social responsibility. So the first level is, how might we think about their economic responsibility, right? The potential cost and benefit of the investment, and it raises the question, must Merck justify the investment to shareholders financially and ethically? All right, so imagine, now you're a shareholder here, right? And you go to the meeting and the CEO comes out and says, oh, I got some good news and some bad news. Now we got this drug here and it's going to help millions, thousands and thousands of people, right? It's this horrible disease, and he shows slides and all that, and people are like, wow, this is a great thing. Here's the bad news. They cannot afford to pay for this. And it's cost us $1 billion, and it's going to continue to cost us money, but the people who really desperately need it cannot afford it. And so it raises the question, well, what are we? Are we in the business here to just give stuff away? And so it's going to cost you, right? You know, from a pure economic standpoint, you are not going to make any money on this, right? So from an economic standpoint, it's really a bad deal. I mean, there's no way to argue that in the immediate sense, right? In the immediate sense, you're going to lose money on this type of a deal. So now let's take a look at, well, before I go on there, I want to kind of double back just a little bit. The immediate financial impact, economic impact is negative. However, if you look at the bigger picture and where people might say, you know, Merck, they spent a lot of their own money to help people. They really did it out of concern for society. What a great company. You know, I'm going to invest in them. I am going to buy their products, right? I really believe in that company. And so this is the kind of way you can think about the economic investment, is that it's going to come back to you in terms of goodwill and reputation, and might I even say God's blessing, right? Because you did the sacrificial thing, because you did something that wasn't just about profits or money, you received a benefit, right? So that's kind of one of the rationales for making an economic investment. Now, and of course, this raises some other good questions too, and I believe there were some examples of this in the book, that some companies didn't want to do this. They didn't want to invest so that it would be like a marketing thing, right? Because that's kind of a cynical view. Well, these organizations, they just do these good things because it's marketing, you know, like Tom's. Yeah, they buy a pair of shoes and they give away a pair of shoes. Well, they're just doing that because you want them to think good about them and whatnot. So, you know, it's a very complex kind of dynamic here, and it has a lot of angles to think through. All right, let's move on here. In terms of legal responsibility, we know that companies have a responsibility to obey the law, but it raises the question, is there a legal responsibility for Merck here? And is there any legal penalty for not doing so? So if they didn't distribute that drug, if they didn't give away that drug, would they be breaking any laws? And I believe the answer was no, right? So if you have the means to do something and don't do it, that doesn't necessarily mean you are breaking the law. There's no law that says you have, you know, they're a for-profit business. There's no law that says you have to give away free product. Now, let's move away onto the next topic. The next angle is the ethical responsibility. Do they have an ethical responsibility to develop the drug? Think in terms of the stakeholders, harms and benefits, greater goods, duties, obligations, ethical values. All right, so this is the deontological and virtue ethics ideas that we talked about early in the class. I think most people would say, yes, they do have an ethical responsibility to develop this drug. And even though people can't pay for it, the benefit it brings to thousands of people to cure this horrible disease is definitely a good thing to do. No question about that. So how do Merck's philosophy and values play a role? And here's a great quote from their founder, who says, "We never try to forget that medicine is for people. It's not for profits. The profits follow, and if we have remembered that, they have never failed to appear." All right, so I like that quote, because here is he saying that, you know, it's not just about profits, it's about people, and that, you know, this right here, this one statement alone might justify giving away all of those drugs to the people, because that's what it's all about, right? Even if it means they're not going to make money, all right? So again, we could kind of look at the stakeholder perspective idea in terms of the Merck case and look at lots of different things, right? The customers don't really necessarily have the money, but it's a good thing to do. In terms of the media interest, there'd be a lot of benefit, a lot of good PR. In terms of the competitors, it might even change, the way drug companies see themselves and their value in society. Others might say, "Wow, well, Merck gave away this drug. Maybe we should do something similar," et cetera, et cetera. And in terms of employees, how would you feel about working for an organization that did such a wonderful thing that helped so many people, even though it didn't make them any profit? In fact, it cost them money. Wouldn't you feel good if you worked for Merck and you knew that you were part of an organization that did that? Yeah, of course you would, right? So it's a real morale builder. It helps you feel that you're part of an organization that's doing something great. Now, here's a good question. In terms of duty and obligations, do ethical duties differ by industry? And does it matter that Merck was a pharmaceutical company? So we might say, yeah, well, they're a drug company and they're all about healing people and helping people get healthy. And, doctors prescribe drugs and doctors are all about healing and health and not about profits. So of course they do. What if, for example, this drug was developed by a maybe Johnson & Johnson, or somebody that makes household cleaners, or maybe a company that builds, an engineering company, and they just happen to come up with this cure. Would you feel that an engineering company was responsible to help people to give away product? Well, maybe not. I think the fact that Merck was in the kind of healing and health business in the first place really made one say, yeah, of course they got to give this stuff away, right? So I think it does matter. I really do. And it's sort of like I mentioned earlier with REI. Well, of course they have a responsibility to the environment. That's what they're all about. They're all about helping people enjoy Mother Nature and get out there and encourage people to be responsible. Is philanthropy a social responsibility of business? Now, this is a great question. In our discussion, I've given you guys the option to read a great article that kind of challenges the assumption and helps us think clearly about this, right? Because again, CSR is kind of one of those, I don't want to say trendy things, but it's really evolved, and it's almost like if you don't do it, you're considered irresponsible, right? So it raises some good questions about whether it is a responsibility or not, or is it just a nice thing to do? And so this kind of gets back to the Merck case. If you were the CEO, what would you decide, and what would be the major basis for your decision? So here's some of the takeaways here in terms of the Merck case. Remember, decisions are not single events. Decision to pursue research led to this. Decision to provide drugs for free forever. The decision to develop logistics plans, etc., etc. Organizational values can and should guide responsibility decisions. Employees' values should be taken into account, and organizations can be ethical leaders, and other firms will often follow, which was the case in the Merck case. So that's it for now. Hope this was helpful. See you on the other end.